Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, The Sustainable City. Thank you in advance for spending some time with us today. I'm Helena Shaw, Associate Director of Columbia Beijing Center, which is the regional hub in China of Columbia University to facilitate and promote the academic exchange and research collaboration between Columbia students, scholars with local counterparts or the regional counterparts. So we are very glad to host this group of distinguished scholars here in partnership with the Columbia University Press, centered around the book, The Sustainable City, second edition, to engage with the scholars in the field and to discuss and analyze sustainable urban planning and the sustainable infrastructure related initiative, legislation, program, and financing of public-private partnership and other issues. I think we all know that China is a country of more than 1.4 billion people, where the urbanization of the permanent population in 2022 has reached, I think, over 65%. So our collective well-being is closely depending on how sustainable the city where we live are. So we're very honored that we will hear the insights from this group of scholars and their concerns on building and maintaining the sustainable cities. So let me briefly introduce the distinguished scholar today, and then we'll give the microphone to them right away. So the first one is Dr. Stephen Cohen. He is the Senior Vice Dean of Columbia School of Professional Studies and professor in the practice of public affairs at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He is also the director of the Master of Public Administration program in Environmental Science and Policy at SIPA, director of Master of Science in Sustainability Management at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. The second one is also a Columbia scholar, Dr. Dong Guo. He is Associate Director of the Research Program on Sustainability Policy and Management at Columbia University. He also served as Associate Research Scholar and adjunct faculty at School of International and Public Affairs and School of Professional Studies. Our third scholar tonight or today with us is Dr. Da Jianzhu. He is professor in the Department of Public Administration and director of the UNEP Tongji Institute of Environment for Sustainability Development at Tongji University. Dr. Chu is also a member of the Social Science Commission under the jurisdiction of the Chinese the Ministry of Education, and also Expert Commission on Sustainable Development and Resource and Environment under the jurisdiction of Ministry of Construction in China, and many others. Our fourth one scholar is Dr. Junjie Li. She is Associate Professor, Deputy Director of the Department of Architecture, and an organizing committee member of the party branch of the Department of Agriculture at Beijing Jiaotong University. Lastly but not least, Dr. Wan Liu, Associate Dean of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the School of Architecture at Tsinghua University. She has been working and teaching urban design and architecture criticism for a very long time and won a lot of awards. So welcome again, and thank you so much for joining us today. So without further ado, I think I will, should I invite Professor Cohen give a like 5 or 10 minutes presentation? Professor Cohen, now
sure.
The stage is yours.
Yeah.
420.
So a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Sustainable City, and my good colleague Dong Guo read it and told me I was being overly parochial, focused too much on New York City and America, and we had to broaden it. And that led to the second edition that he helped to write and improve dramatically. So the book, The Sustainable City, is really based on my work in sustainability management, but brought to a geographic scale. So what sustainability management is are the organizational management practices that brings about sustainable development. And this field of sustainability management is expanding. It's combining environmental issues with routine organizational management, what we sometimes
Oh,
call.
do you want to share your slides?
No, I think it's the amount of time we have is probably not such a good idea.
Okay.
So I'll just talk through it a little bit. Sustainability management really says that issues like energy, water, environmental impact, climate adaptation, these now have to become routine issues of organizational management. And then bringing this to a geographic scale, we start to think about cities as being sustainable. And I think what I want you to be thinking about here is that cities have been evolving really historically over the last couple of centuries. I'll give New York City as an example. New York City was a trading city. Because of the Erie Canal, we were able to get produce from the middle of America and ship it to Europe. And that's what created some of the surplus wealth that allowed New York City to develop. Then we became, believe it or not, a manufacturing city. In fact, when I grew up in New York, I worked in a bicycle factory. We used to make things in New York. Columbia University has a building called the Studebaker Building, which was an automobile factory. At the end of World War II, 47% of the GDP of New York City was in clothing manufacturing. 95% of the clothes worn in America were made in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Now, between 1947 and 1975, that all changed completely. And we didn't really understand what was going on. Part of it was, you see the invention of containerized shipping, and the docks we had in Manhattan were too small. We started to see a need for more horizontal factories, and our factories were vertical. They were located in places, if you know New York, like Tribeca. If you ever visit New York City, you see something called the High Line. This is a park, but it used to be a train that led from the docks to our factories. The docks are gone, the factories are gone, and we lost about 1 million people in the 1970s and 80s as this transition was going on, and we didn't really understand what was happening. And so what happened is we became a service-oriented city. So New York City then gained back 1 million people. Our economy focused on education, healthcare, communication, finance, services, and interestingly enough, the fashion design industry. 500,000 people in New York City work in fashion design, but not making clothes. We just think about it. And so the New York City has been transitioning then from a manufacturing to a service city. Now we are in the process of transitioning to a sustainable city. And what do I mean by that? A city that uses resources as efficiently as possible, uses renewable resources as much as possible, and recycles as much as possible. Now, we're in the midst of this transition. It's going to be a generation-long transition, just as we saw the transition from manufacturing to service. And we are beginning to see this here in New York City. The use of electric vehicles, energy efficiency measures, renewable energy measures, sewage treatment. New York City's under Michael Bloomberg, built a 3rd water tunnel, bringing clean water from upstate New York into New York City. These things are starting to happen. Eventually, we're going to have to figure out a way to take all of our waste and start mining resources from it to create a circular economy. And we are in the very early stages of thinking about that. So the sustainable city talks about what are those infrastructures that are needed, systems in energy, water, solid waste management, sewage treatment, food, parks, transportation. And of course, now we've learned we also need a system of public health. Cities require density, and you can't have social distance and density at the same time. And so we have to get much better globally at doing the things that we failed to do in COVID-19, which is to detect and track and isolate and eventually inoculate and cure the new viruses that are going to come, because COVID-19 is not the first. It won't be the last. We're going to see more of this because global travel And global supply chains, for all the attacks it's under, are not going to ever go away. The world economy depends on those things. And so these systems are being developed. Also, I'll conclude with one other element, which is that lifestyles are changing. People are living differently and they're spending their time differently. In my class the other day, I asked my students, how much of your time do you spend looking at this thing? And I think the average was about 7 hours a day. Now, this is something that didn't exist 25 years ago. And nobody knew that they had to carry a computer in their pocket wherever they went. And they had to be in constant touch with families and relatives, so they had to photograph their food when they went to restaurants. And yet this has become part of how people live. People are spending much more time reading information, watching videos, communicating with each other. Why? Because the cost of information and communication has basically gone to close to zero. When I was a college student, when I graduated from college, I went to Europe for a little tour, and I didn't call my family because a phone call from Europe in the mid-1970s would have cost me as much as staying in a hotel for a week. My daughter lives in Israel, and I hear from her on FaceTime pretty much every day, and it's free. And so these technologies have changed how people live. In addition, young people are increasingly interested less in ownership and more in experiencing. And that's led to the sharing economy, where Airbnb or Lyft and Uber and those kinds of companies, in some respects, are substituting for ownership. Now, there are in the developing world, of course, ownership is still a status symbol, but in a place like New York City, owning a car is no great asset. You have to park it, you have to insure it, and you have to maintain it. It's a lot easier just to use your smartphone to call someone. So the sustainable lifestyle and more awareness of environmental issues and wellness and physical fitness is changing how people live. And I think that's the other element of what's going on. So to conclude, we're in the midst of a great social change, great economic change. Culture moves economy. I mean, technology moves culture, culture moves economics, economics moves politics. It doesn't work the other way around. And so what's happening right now is a massive cultural change in how people live and how they spend their time. And that's basically one of the themes of the sustainable city. And what Danghua added to this analysis, I just talked about New York City. He extended it to a really excellent treatment of the rest of the world, and particularly a focus on China. And I understand that they're in the midst of translating our book into Chinese. And so we're hoping that people all over China will be able to read our work. So Dong, I hope I summarized this correctly for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Steve, for the introduction of our book. You're being too modest. Yes, the book, as Steve said, is being translated into Chinese by CITIC Press. So our hope is that it'll be published by CITIC before the year end. I guess I have many questions. I'll start with a few for our panelists, and then we'll see if there are questions from the audience. I know apart from the people that are on Zoom here, there are many more watching on the live streaming platforms, and you already have very interesting questions. But I'll start a few for myself, and we'll see from there. So Steve, I'll go back to you. There's a lot of people, we hear this in the news. There's a lot of people moving back to cities in the U.S. As you said, that's probably a trend started even before COVID, a little bit interrupted by the pandemic. So what in your mind are some of the motivators behind it? You talk about technology and the lifestyle change, attraction by some of the cities. In China, we often think of urbanization as one of the main drivers for economic transformation. But that's clearly not the way the US got developed, right? It's more expensive. So what do you think people in the US are embracing the urbanization models again, if at all?
Well, I think first, in the year 1900, 40% of the people in the United States worked in agriculture. Last year is 1%. And the reason for that is that agriculture has become automated. And so people had to leave the rural part of the world because there was no way to make a living. Many then came into cities, and now, of course, the factories are getting automated. And so that's why we're going to have more and more of them as graduate students, Dom. And we have whole new professions being invented, events planners and physical trainers and web designers. And so I think we're moving into the brain-based economy. And that requires a certain concentration. Now we learned because of COVID, you can now, because of the Zoom environment, you don't necessarily have to be concentrated. But I think we're going to discover people really like to be together. So at the beginning of the 21st century, for the first time in world history, a majority of the planet lived in cities. By the middle of this century, that will be 75%. Part of it is going to be economic, that it's just going to be, that's where the opportunities are. And ultimately, that's going to be what people prefer. But because of technology, particularly in some places, you can have exurban and suburban lifestyles where you're connected to urban life, but at a distance. But I do think that the rural lifestyle, living close to nature, is really impossible with 8 billion people on the planet because there's just too many of us and there's just not enough nature.
Right. Next, I'll pose this question to Professor Zhu. I know, Professor Zhu, you have worked extensively on urban sustainability. China has really been following this urbanization model with a lot of people moving to the urban centers, but that obviously has created a lot of sustainability issues in the major cities. Congestion, air pollution, all of that. We have seen some improvement on some of those fronts. Can you share some of the progress that, in your mind, Chinese cities have made on sustainability? I'll obviously ask you to comment on the book. I know I sent everyone a hard copy. So if you have any comments to the book as well, please share. But more importantly, what in your mind are some of the major challenges the Chinese cities are facing, in terms of transforming their economies towards this more sustainable stage?
好，我就直接用中文讲了啊。首先我要祝贺这个科恩教授跟郭东博士啊，这个出了这么一本可持续发展、可持续城市的书。那个我看了那个内容啊，我倒觉得这个题目更恰当的是管理可持续城市。因为可持续城市的书，已经看到过这个不少，包括英文版的。但是从管理角度啊，管理内容比例比较重的，我倒觉得这是它的一个特色。那么看到这本书呢，我倒顺便讲，实际上是科恩教授，我是这个10多年前啊就知道科恩教授的名字了。04、05年的时候，我曾经到哈佛去做高级研究学者。那么当时在联系学校的时候呢，也曾经联系过哥伦比亚的这个科恩教授，包括萨克斯刚刚从哈佛跑到哥伦比亚来，所以老早就知道科恩教授的大名了。当然那时候就知道科恩教授是在公共管理的那个学院里面的，对吧？所以今天很高兴啊，这个能够见到科恩教授跟郭东博士，我们正好讨论这本书。那么对你们表示一下祝贺啊。那么刚才问到郭东博士问到的我要谈的几个话题呢，我提供大概这几方面的信息供你们参考。我大概有4个方面，时间不能太长，我简单的讲一讲。在上海对纽约是非常关注的。那么这个上海这边呢，最近几年来，这个围绕可持续城市啊，有这样3件事啊，也许我们可以加强沟通、加强联系的。2010年上海搞了一个世博会，世博会的一个主题呢，就是围绕城市可持续发展的。虽然城市的题目叫 Better City, Better Life， 那么实际上它的主题后来就落到 Sustainable City。 那么2010年以后呢，上海每年出一本城市可持续发展的手册。那么上海呢，那个明年大概要在联合国人居署的支持下，要颁布一个城市可持续发展的上海奖，这是不是面向中国的，面向全世界的？所以这是一个信息。那么刚才我就讲了，上海实际上对城市可持续发展非常感兴趣。那么每年在发布城市可持续发展手册，在编制城市可持续发展指数，然后呢要发布一个全球的城市可持续发展奖。所以这个信息可以供我们2位的这个科恩教授跟郭东博士参考，我们可以加强这方面联系。我自己本人呢，对研究纽约、对研究伦敦、对研究东京、对研究几个 global city 的 sustainability 这个是非常感兴趣的，这是一个信息。那么第二个信息呢，我讲一下中国的。刚才郭东博士问中国大概的这方面的进展，可以举一举的是什么？我讲3个方面的。一个呢，这个国际上现在最基本的把可持续发展的3个支柱用到城市里边，等于是经济支柱、环境支柱、社会支柱来讨论这个城市的可持续发展。那么中国呢，现在把它 governance 作为它的第4个支柱，所以在国际上一般简称就4个支柱。那么中国现在对可持续发展理解呢，是扩展到把文化单独拉出来，所以中国有个5位一体的发展概念。那么这个5位一体就把经济、社会、环境、文化和治理作为城市可持续发展的5大方面来研究城市可持续发展的，所以这是一个信息。那么我们前面讲到的研究城市可持续发展指标城市可持续发展其他方面都是按照这个几个方面来展开的。但是这个展开里边非常重要的一个概念呢，就是脱钩的概念，就是就跟我看到你们2位的书里边呢，就把城市可持续的定义就是在实现城市经济社会繁荣的时候，尽可能把我们的环境影响最小化。所以我们就讲 decouple economic and social development with resource consumption and environmental impact。那么这样一种脱钩的概念呢，来理解城市可持续发展和评估它的一个发展的一个绩效。所以这是我讲中国的一个理解，这跟你们有很多的共同语言了。那么这是中国的一个方面。第2个方面，我看这个邮件里面，郭东博士也通过这个小蔡传过来，就是中国是自上而下的。那么我也讲2个信息，中国实际上是有2大部门在推进城市可持续发展，一个是发改委，发改委呢，它每5年做一个发展规划。这个发展规划虽然不叫可持续发展规划，但实际上它里面就是按照经济社会环境治理以及加上文化这几个方面展开的。所以自上而下的一个手段，可能这个手段在其他国家是没有的。因为我看美国也好，欧洲也好，除了少部分是政府的一个体制化的行为，大多数属于第3部门或者是学者，或者是我们的企业的咨询机构在做这个。那么中国是每5年有个政府自上而下的5年的一个大的战略行动，这是一种中国编制发展计划的一种方法。这种方法呢，新加坡也在这么做，对吧？也在这么做。那么这是一个信息。另外一个信息呢，中国的自然资源部它现在国土空间的时候，把经济社会环境这3大块是非常明显的对应起来的。它现在有3根红线。我们讲的资源环境最小影响，它就通过硬杠杆变成一个生态保护红线和永久农田红线 farmland 是 limit 是什么？然后呢，城市的增长边界，美国把它叫做urban growth 对吧？boundaries 这个城市增长边界呢，这样3根红线是中国的自然资源部通过它的法定手续要求城市都要把这个3个红线，然后城市的膨胀、城市的扩张是在这个3个红线里面进行的。这是中国的一个推进可持续发展非常重要的，可以供你们提供的一个信息。这是我讲的第2个方面，中国自上而下怎么在推进的。第3个方面呢， 邮件告诉我里面也关注我们的 finance how to support urban sustainable development。那么我就想呢，实际上一个比较新的动向，我们把它叫做 XOD， 就是交通里面有个 TOD 的概念 ，Transit Oriented Development。那么中国现在把它扩展到不仅是交通枢纽，扩展到许多，比如说文化项目、生态项目为主导的一种综合发展。比如说 ecological oriented development 就是以生态修复为主导的，但是兼顾其他那个是利益的这样一种发展。那么生态项目呢，政府要有公共的资金做点支持，但是呢，它可以发展一点 PPP， 发展一点公司那个合作的项目，来带来一点这个是消费者自费的项目，可以使得它做到工业性跟这个盈利性的平衡。那么这就是政府怎么样来解决像这样一种环境跟发展的综合项目，要解决它的那个金融支持的一种方法，我们把它叫做 XOD。那么这就是第三个信息。所以因为时间这个很有限了，我先把刚才这样3个方面信息，中国如何来界定城市可持续发展，如何定义，然后中国自上而下的这个推进机制的体制安排是什么，然后呢，怎么样来用 PPP 模式来解决 sustainable financing to urbanization 这样的模式。那么这样3个方面信息啊，供我们2位这个科恩教授跟郭东博士供点参考。那么这个我先很简略的讲这个，到时有讨论的我可以再展开。我不知道我这样讲清楚了没有？
谢谢周老师啊，你这个把我要问的问题一次性都给讲完了。咱们一会儿这个时间的话，这个再展开来讨论一下。像刚才您说的，实际上上海有这个可持续发展排名的这个蓝皮书也好，我们实际上一直在与中国国际经济交流中心合作搞一个中国城市和省际的这个可持续排名。可能从15年开始吧，每年也发布这个中国可持续评估的这个蓝皮书。后来还有阿里巴巴研究院和飞利浦的这个参与。现在去网上一搜都能搜到，就比如中国城市可持续排名，应该出来的都是我们做的这个工作。排了好些年了。主要是对这个100个大中型城市进行一个他们的可持续城市排名，包括省级别的31个这个省级的这个也会做一个排名。还有这个全国的一个可持续发展的一个现状每年都会做一个评估。所以感兴趣的同学呢，我也想说一下，就是可以去看一看。我还不知道咱们有这个渊源这个下来的话，你可以跟这个 Steve 再进一步交流一下，不知道有这个渊源。I guess my next question is for Professor Li. We talk a lot about this in the book, that perhaps living in apartment buildings in cities is generally more energy efficient and environmentally friendly way of life than living in suburban houses, which is more like the case in the US. So from your perspective and from your research, I don't know if this is a fair characterization, or is the picture actually more complicated?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. And thanks very much for letting me here to talk about this great discuss. And firstly, let me congratulate for you guys to publish this book. And during these days, I read through the whole book. And I think that with a basic understanding this book, and I think I can find I have something I can share with you here. But also I found we have the interpreter here. So if I would like to save the time, I would switch to Chinese. Is that okay?
Sure, it's simultaneous, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't waste time. Either case.
OK， 所以我就为了节约时间像楚老师刚刚讲的这样，我也是觉得可能我从中文的方面可能会更节约时间，把我们想说的事情说清楚。那这2天呢，我也看了一下这本书，这本书呢其实也学到了很多有趣的东西很有意思。那这本书里边从这个个体化的、组织上的、经济，还有 比如说量化的方式，还有社区还有政府，甚至是更大的全球的话题来讨论这个可持续 sustainability 的这个问题那么其中呢也讨论到了关于能源efficiency 能源的效率，还有一些 renewable energy 的事情。那刚刚呢那个郭博士也介绍了就是我可能做的比较多的这10几年也是在做关于可持续里边的关于能源的问题。那我今天我也就是想聊一下关于可持续里边关于energy efficiency 这个事儿。那么其实呢关于这个能源建筑行业应该说占到了我们整个的这个排放的1/3以上。那从碳排放的角度来讲的话，2020年的这个国家的这个公共建筑节能的这个报告上面也指出建筑行业的碳排放已经占到了48%的这个比重。所以应该说建筑行业是我们这个双碳目标达成的一个主要的主战场了。怎么样去减少这个碳排放？应该说在建筑行业里边，不仅是从我们说这种建筑的设计、建造等等这些去考虑，可能更长远的是一个整个的一个更大范畴的经济生产的这样过程。所以呢，其实从中国政府来讲的话，也非常重视这件事情从这个2020年底开始到现在从中央办公厅、国务院到这个住建部分别发布了很多重要性的文件，其中有一个文件呢是关于建筑节能与可再生能源利用的通用规范。那么这个通用规范呢是从今年的2022年4月1号开始执行。那么在执行这件事情了以后，同时与这个规范相关冲突的这个内容呢就对应的做了废止。那么在这个规范里边，实际上就重点强调了2件事情一件事情呢是在能做的新建筑里边，尽可能的去这个结合可再生能源，为可再生能源提供这个条件。那么在整个城市发展的这个范畴之内其实也是强调了这个能源的这种分布式的管理以及能源的转型这个话题。然后另外呢，就是关于我们的新建、扩建和改造建筑。那么从这个新的这个规范上来从这个国家型的强制性规范的要求来说的话，就要求我们所有的建筑都需要去做这个节能设计，要去做碳排放的计算，去满足这个我们3060的这个目标和计划，碳中和、碳达峰的计划。所以呢，其实在这个大背景之下其实建筑行业其实承担着非常重要的角色，去考虑国家的这个整个战略发展的这个碳排放的问题。那么这个过程当中呢，关于我们城市的可持续这个问题里边呢，就会涉及到不仅仅是可再生能源的问题。因为我自己是一个建筑学背景的，所以呢从建筑师来讲的话，其实建筑的设计，从建筑的空间原型设计到被动式设计到我们说这种主动式的利用跟建筑的结合这一块，其实都非常的重要。我在这本书里边其实看到了很多就是关于提到这个 renewable energy 和 energy efficiency 相关的内容，并且对比了我们说这个美国的一些城市我们看到就是美国的这个芝加哥，然后还有美国的很多城市与北京之间的这个关系那么从这个层面上面呢，其实也可以做一个未来如果说我们有机会去合作，那么我觉得我们也可以从比如说中国和美国的相关可再生能源的利用，尤其是在城市里边可再生能源利用的这个层面上面去做一个相应的对比研究然后第二个方面呢，其实刚刚科文教授提到了关于气候变化这个问题。事实上气候变化这个问题呢，在我们现在是一个不得不面临的问题。比如说极端气候，然后这个水灾、地震等等这种灾害是频发的。那么这些年呢，我们这边也在做一些关于可持续灾后应急的事情就是在建筑行业这个里边，特别是我看在这本书里边反复提到了关于 COVID-19 的这个事件那么这个应该说已经成为了一个全球性的事件，是我们全人类都要去重视和关注的，也正因为如此诞生了很多种方法理念，包括建筑设计，包括这种经济或者是行为上的运行。那么所以呢，其实在这种应急的这个层面上面来说的话， 这种可持续的理念其实也应该有必要纳入进来。就像我们去年和今年哈一直在跟这个 BRE 英国的这个团体这个 BRE 这个协会去合作，那么我们用到的呢是关于这个 QSAM， 就是可以量化灾后可持续性能的这样的一个评价体系。在这个评价体系的背景之下，它跟以往的这种应急啊、救灾啊不一样的是，它更强调的是我们说的这种可持续的这个理念。比如说，它会更关注于材料的来源，这个我想在这本书里边我也看到了很多相应的内容哈，更关注于我们场地的选择，更关注于能源、水系统等等哈，就是相应的这些的来源。那么不仅仅是我们整个的民用建筑这个大行业哈，可能在未来的各种建筑行业的分支里边，我想呢可能都会涉及到关于可持续的问题。那包括我们现在这个评价体系也是越做越细哈，越做越精致，针对于不同的时间段，针对于不同的建筑类型，可能都会去讨论关于可持续的话题。那未来呢，在很多种建筑领域里面哈，其实我们觉得哈也是有很多可能的这个点哈，也在这本书里边找到了对应的回答。然后第三呢，其实我想说的是关于这个可持续的这种人文发展，对。因为其实在这个可持续的这个发展大背景之下，可持续的三大支柱包括了社会、那个环境和这个经济这三大层面。那么其实这个我们说这个环境的负荷，大家也已经充分的意识到了这个问题，对吧？我们的环境的负荷、环境的污染、资源的匮竭、气候的变化，大家已经充分认识到了。所以我们不仅我们在资源上的获取的方法途径，其实都是在被逐渐的高度的重视的。那么其实在中国的这个政策体系之下，也在这个整个环境，因为其实中国从上个世纪的这个80年代前后哈到90年代出的相关的跟可持续发展相关的这种规范条文，实际上更多的是关于能源的问题，所以它更多的关注在环境上面。那么接下来包括后来的这些评价体系和规范规则上面，其实也是探讨的关于节能和能源利用的问题，所以环境这个事情已经得到了高度的重视。另外一端呢，我们说经济这个层面上面，关于这个双碳目标，其实它就是一个数字上的碳经济的一个产出一个结果。所以呢，其实我们最终为了去达到这个双碳目标的达成，实际上经济这件事情已经在不断的去描绘、去研讨了。所以呢，其实经济这件事情，当然今天有那个同济大学的楚老师啊，他是经济方面的专家，也是特别希望跟楚老师在碳经济上面多做学习。但是呢，就是我是觉得哈，就是这两块其实已经被高度重视起来了。但是呢，关于社会这块，尤其是这个可持续的人文发展这块哈，这个看起来呢，其实相对来讲没有那么硬核哈。但是呢，其实在我们更长远的发展来看的话，我们说可持续这个 topic，其实它的核心是一个既满足我们当代人，又满足下一代人。它的核心的对象、服务的对象还是人。那么在这个社会的背景之下，这个人文发展这个背景之下，怎么样去在这个更多的人的这个共识上面哈，然后包括这个人文发展上面，比如说从人文社会科学里面去探讨人的需求，比如说针对于灾后这样的场景，人们的需求，人的人文关怀是怎么样的？我认为可能也是可持续发展未来的一个非常重要的一个点。所以当然我在这本书里边也看到了很多关于人，比如说 public park 之类的哈，就是这种公共的公园，然后公共的场所，大家的交流互通的这种可能性。所以我觉得可能在这本书上啊，可能是一个引导性的这种支撑哈。那么在可能很多的领域，比如说科学技术、空间、经济学、环境学、人文科学等等这些领域，或许都能找到他能找到的答案。以上就是我要分享的哈。但是目前问题的话，可能一会儿可能大家讨论起来，我们再聊。郭博士，
谢谢李老师。Well, I guess following up from Professor Lee's comments, 30/60. Our understanding is that many cities and organizations in China, they're trying to develop guidelines, in order to achieve China's twin carbon targets by, carbon peaking by 2030 and then carbon neutrality by 2060. And I've heard a lot of conversations around the city's role in this. We, obviously talk about this quite a bit in the book. How the Chinese cities, includes not just the urban parts of it, but also 我们叫农村和原野. So in fact, if the Chinese cities were to achieve carbon peaking, then that means the entirety of China would have achieved its goal. So, I guess, do you agree with that assumption, or, what role do you think a city can play in helping the country achieve those twin targets?
Thanks for the invitation first to have this very good opportunity to communicate. This book is very impressive. As we all know, sustainability is a very important long-term topic and eventually developed from the environmental concerns to social, economical, and resilience of built environment. So I found in this book, following its specific logic, many aspects of sustainable development are discussed. So providing enlightening thinking and discussion. To answer the talk about the questions Professor Guo Dong mentioned, I would like to talk a little about what happened in China now after Professor Zhu. I think we could sum up like this: on the state level, ecological red lines, low carbon development are the main policy. So the state defines ecological red line for strict protection, which means from the overall situation of the whole country, it is required that the urban construction area should not spread excessively and should develop orderly under the constraints, resources, and the environment. So this is the most crucial considering amount and impact. Then secondly, on the middle level, local government and academic circle have taken some actions on like Spawn City, greening index, resilient city infrastructure, things like that, and all kinds of technical research. Many still have a long way to go, but China is big enough and practice are very rich, and things would happen eventually. And on the macro level, regeneration of certain areas, like park rewilding and low carbon technology and LED. These technology studies and practice are very actively exploring. So the issue of sustainability has received a sustained attention in China. And Professor and Dr. Guo mentioned NIMBY behavior. I think, yes, in old community improving projects, even if it involves personal benefits, it is still hard to push forward. So at least from one side, I think the government or manager should improve the quality of the project, because in the case of community, people often worry about and actually see the rough engineering quality, things like that. So similar from other sustainable infrastructure, we should think about what people worry about and try to understand their concern and balance their long-term and short-term interests. Though, yeah, it would not be easy, but we should try. And I think I would go on with the second and the two other questions, second and the third question.
That's okay. We can come back to them.
Sorry?
We can come back to those questions later.
Okay.
我们一会儿再回来可以讨论一些这个人文方面的问题啊，我看大家对这方面的讨论很多。So Steve, I'll go back to you. Our Chinese colleagues, obviously have spoken about the 30, 60 carbon targets set by the Chinese central government. What about the U.S.? What are their overall effort in terms of carbon reduction, achieving the climate goals? Maybe something's happening at the federal level. If not, what about at the state and the local level? Are cities doing certain things for themselves in terms of improved overall sustainability, but also in terms of helping with climate change?
Tom, did you want me to talk about that?
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay. Well, first, we did see last week, and actually probably tomorrow, the Congress of the United States is passing a substantial $380 billion climate change bill. Added to that is the federal infrastructure bill in the United States and the federal government's edict to be purchasing green. So at the federal level, we're finally seeing some activity, but at the state and local level, this has been going on for a while, particularly large states like New York and California. And perhaps even more importantly, corporations are starting to look at their use of energy. One prominent example of that is Walmart, which they have a lot of very large stores with big parking lots, and many of their large stores are now covered by solar arrays. And they're not doing it necessarily because of their rampant environmentalism. They're doing it because it saves money. And I think in the end, that is going to be how sustainability comes about. That particularly on the energy side, renewable resources are less expensive than fossil fuels. Now, that's in the long run. There are actually, the cost curves are showing right now that renewable energy is less expensive, but there are places and there are issues of reliability and batteries and so forth. But the problem with fossil fuels is you have to get them out of the ground, and that costs money and pollutes. Then you have to ship it, and that costs money and pollutes. Then you have to burn it, and that costs money and pollutes. And the fossil fuels are finite. So it's not that anybody's making any more of it. It's not that we're going to run out, but they're getting harder to get to. You contrast that to the sun. The sun will outlast the human species. It's going to be around longer than we will be. It's free, and the technology to absorb it and save it is only getting better and cheaper. And I often compare it to the technology of computing and what was called Moore's law, which is that on a regular basis, renewable energy is getting, and particularly battery technology, but solar cell technology is getting more efficient and more effective. And pretty soon, it's literally going to drive fossil fuels from the marketplace. And we've seen these kinds of technological transitions happen all over the economy. Perhaps the best example of it is how people see movies at home. We used to have these things called video cassettes, and then they got replaced by DVDs. One day Netflix said, we're not going to send them to you anymore. We're going into the streaming business. Everybody said they're crazy. They weren't crazy. Nobody buys DVDs anymore. Everything is streaming. And so, it used to be people had cable television in their homes and they had wired internet. My students don't have any of that anymore. They completely rely on wireless, and essentially the technological base of communication keeps getting more efficient, more effective, and less expensive. And the research that's going on all over the world on solar and wind and batteries is clearly starting to pay off. And so I saw a video the other day of the Easter parade in New York City in 1905, and the commentator said, look for the automobile, and there was one automobile in the video, and everything else was horses. And then in 1915, same place, same parade, he said, look for the horse. All you see are motor vehicles. And in 10 years, New York City went from being horse-drawn to having a subway and automobiles. And that's the same thing we're going to see here. And that's actually why I have so much confidence that this transition is going to be happening. The last thing I would say is that, you know, the decoupling of environmental pollution and economic growth started here around 1980. Now, we passed most of our environmental laws during the 1970s. And it took about 10 years to ramp up. But and so you see GDP and pollution growing at the same rate throughout the 20th century. And then in 1980, pollution starts to go down, and it has been going down ever since. And GDP has continued to rise. And everybody says, well, you sent all your dirty industries overseas. That isn't what happened. I mean, we did send dirty industries overseas, but most of the air pollution came from motor vehicles and power plants. And we have a lot more of both of those now, but we learned how to use technology to control their emissions. And that's the same thing that we can do in general in our economy. So there's no reason why we have to destroy the planet to enjoy economic growth. And the idea that those two things are a trade-off is ridiculous. And in fact, empirically, we know it's not true. And again, that's really part of why I have confidence that we're going to solve all of these problems.
Yeah, that's very important. You know, obviously in China and a lot of the developing countries, people and governments worry there's a trade-off, right? You know, now you have to deal with the environmental issues, but maybe you have to make a sacrifice on economic growth, which is not so ideal. But yeah, if that's not the case, if that's not the experience of the developed countries, that's something to look forward to. So I'll go back to Professor Liu. We started to talk about the NIMBYism and the social issues. I actually read a very interesting paper, award-winning study that sort of looked at the social inequality within cities. Now we know the social inequality is most acute within cities, not in between cities. So there's that study actually looked at how the social disparity is very severe, even between the two sides of a railway track that runs through a city. You know, usually at the very start of the modern cities in China, they started to build these railway tracks, and then development came afterwards, right? So, so how do we deal with some of the social issues? How do we alleviate some of the inequality issues, access to education more specifically, or to healthcare, within the bigger cities in China, in your opinion?
Okay, well, this is a very difficult question. I think I will try. I could not even answer 1/10 of it. But I would like to talk some related issue. In this book, I read a short paragraph attracted my attention, that reflection on Highline New York, the last paragraph. In fact, this is also the problem we are facing today. In China, in many most so-called successful regeneration projects, this is a common problem. It could be very successful commercially, but if it refers to socially and culturally sustainable, no doubt there's big problem. So as a human society, social equity should be an important part of in our discussion on sustainability. So during the past 20 to 30 years in China's rapid development, we lost many meaningful social space. People know about the 798 art area or Songzhuang Artist Village in Beijing. Today they're called cultural and creative zone. But many years ago, who lived there and worked there in those alternative spaces? Could they afford this booming? And who visits them? Would the former visitors or young art lovers afford to visit today's 798? So things like that. We also like to visit old city area or those old villages as a tourist destination. But the small number of old people might be the last generation who has lived there for generations. So where did the people go and how do they make a living? I think who and what do we develop for? That is also a question we often have to think about. So, although there are some techniques and we have design methods to solve many problems, but from the very beginning we should think what we could do to make the sustainability on other sides. Yes.
Thank you. I still have a lot more questions, but given we only have 20 minutes left to the discussion, I'll ask some questions that we have from the audience. So there's one question about sponge cities, garden cities, or sanitary cities. How are they related to a sustainable city? I was going to ask Professor Li a question on the green infrastructures, green rooftops. Maybe those are related concepts. So perhaps you like to take that question from the audience.
Yeah, actually, I'm background in architecture, and maybe the question is better for Professor Liu. It is better, but I can talk more other about for the the rural countryside, because in 14 years ago I was in the rural countryside to do some project for the vulnerable people, and these people are quite in a poor condition, and they live in a round-earth house, and their economy, their income is quite low. But during these decade years, we found that with the development of the sustainable development, and the government have gave a lot of help to the people who live there. But the main problem is the government try to install the the infrastructure of the city of the village, and try to install a lot of PV panels on the roof to give their some financial support. But the main problem is for the rural countryside people is that they don't have any way of to earn more income for them. So they just stay at home and have their if the PV panels can pay back some money, and just stay at home and wait for the money. So that is the main problem, I would say, in the humanity aspect for the social people. So for the people have to find more way to find a more what they have to do, what they can do for the future, and to get more sustainable development for the countryside. And I think I just come back from that village several days ago, and when I come back from that country, I just think that the only help from the government and the only help for the others is not enough. They have to find their own way to make the village more sustainability. I think that this is the most problem for the countryside, especially in the China rural countryside, to solve this problem. But for the city, I think for the high density, the renewable energy actually is quite quite limited. Yeah, and for even though we have to, we ask even in Beijing city. We ask for each new constructed building have to install over 40% of the PV panels on the rooftop. But actually, it is for the high density, and all of the building are quite quite high. And in every residential house, they live a lot of people, and the energy requirement is quite high. And the roof area is quite limited for each house can benefit from the renewable energy. So for city, it's another problem that it's not enough. Maybe can only solve a very limited energy supply for each residential house. So at this stage, most of the building are just in a demonstration level. But the more the more area for sustainable development, especially for the energy, maybe the main stage is in the rural countryside. Yeah, that is my point. And for the last question, I think maybe Professor Liu is more professional than me. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe Professor Liu or Professor Zhu, you want to answer that question? The green infrastructure, the rooftop gardens has been touted by many cities as the effective approach to absorb rainwater or reduce stormwater runoff. And many cities in China experienced that in the past. I came from Zhengzhou myself. There was a terrible rainfall storm last year, July 20th. A few hundred people died from that. So it's a very serious issue. So that's why I think this is a very good question where it asks, some of the sponge cities or garden cities or sanitary cities, do they provide good experiences or practices for building sustainable urban centers? Do either of you want to answer that question?刘老师，朱老师，你们有想说的吗？没开麦克风，朱老师没开麦克风。
那个我就你刚才讲到那个绿色屋顶的事情啊，我简单的谈一下，因为那个海绵城市啊、花园城市这个技术性的事情可能比较强一点，请我们搞建筑的教授做个回应好了。那个实际上像北京、上海啊、深圳这样，在中国的大城市里边，可能像这样一种双碳的目标或者是可再生能源替代，有两种思路。一种呢是属于集中式的，那个你像北京、上海也好，大量的它还是电气化，电气化还是要靠全局性的那个整个的西部的可再生能源，通过那个是高压输电的过来，然后输到我们大城市里面，这是解决它的大头。至于那些绿色屋顶的分布式的，那可能只是小范围里边提供点补充作用。这是可能是对中国，因为中国的城市啊，那个随便一个中小城市，它的能见都可能比欧洲啊、比美国城市要大得多。这是一个非常重要的一个绿色化、低碳化和它的那个可再生能源的一个发展思路。那个我就针对你前面这个问题，我简单的做一点解读好了，好吧？
好的，谢谢朱老师。刘老师，你有补充的吗？没有的话，我们就换下一个问题。
那我简单说两句。这样就是我想，如果说到这些海绵城市啊、花园城市这些，可能有两个层面的事情。一个呢，我们的这些技术标准呢，和一些这个指标，它本身是需要随着发展来做很多调整的，但是我们的标准相对来说在很长的时间才能够形成，并且呢这个一直有很多标准是用很多年的，所以这个事情本身是一个技术上的问题。当然另外一个层面呢，我可能也就没办法多说了，也有更多的事情可能就不是技术层面的事情了。好，我说完了。
好的，Steve, I don't know if you have anything to comment on sponge cities, green rooftop infrastructure. There's a lot of issues with sewer systems. As I said earlier, I came from Zhengzhou, where a huge storm killed a lot of people last year. So I don't know if I have any comments on that. And also, there's one question on governance. How you understand, like in China, it's more a top-down approach. There's a lot of policy making happening at the government level. We talk about the lifestyles that the people have to follow in terms of doing their parts. Are there anything else that they can do in terms of promoting, this overall urban sustainability?
Well, I mean, I think that I again go back to just the sense of how people's lifestyles are different than they were before, and particularly the use of automation, the reduction of manual labor, and what that does at the household level, and what that does to people's daily lives. The other thing that we're still trying to process is, what's the impact of COVID on the workplace? And we're still seeing signs of people not in office jobs not coming back to offices or coming back a few times a week. What does that mean? In New York City, part of what it means is that a little bit more decentralization within the city itself, more of a neighborhood base, and we don't know what impact that's going to have. I mean, I guess what I'd say is that changing technologies is changing our environment. In this case, these issues of health and the technological advances like Zoom, for example. Most of us who are teachers, occasionally would use these technologies, but starting in 2020, we use them all the time, and got to depend on it. Sometimes you and I are 2 blocks away, and we talk through this because we're too lazy to get up and walk. So how does that affect our lifestyles? We don't know yet. I mean, I guess, but I think the thing that is clear is that technologies are rapidly changing, and the impact of that on daily life is still to be decided. I just came back from California, and I take a lot of Ubers when I travel, and every Uber I was in was a Tesla. They're all electric vehicles. And of course, gasoline in California was $6 a gallon, which is pretty expensive. But what I'm saying is that this technology of the electric vehicle has advanced dramatically. I know in China, there are many more electric vehicles as a percentage of your car use than here in the United States. But what does that do to people's daily lives and their behaviors? And we don't really, it's too soon to fully understand it. But I think what we can say for certain is that there's a lot more awareness of people's personal environmental impact, that people are thinking about these things, and 20 or 30 years ago, they didn't think about it at all. And so the way I look at it is, I've been studying environmental policy since 1975. And when I first started studying it, it was a fringe issue. People who thought, oh, well, that's nice, it's something off on the side. Now it's a central issue. Now it's the issue that everybody talks about. In the United States, the Standard & Poor's top 500 corporations in 2010, 10% of them did ESG reports. Last year, it was over 90%. So it's an indication of how these issues are becoming more central to how we think about ourselves. And I think it has to do with pollution, has to do with climate change, and has to do with young people inheriting a planet that they feel is threatened. And so I think that that's changing perceptions and behaviors. I guess that's my overall take on what's going on right now, that we're in the midst of another transition, a very significant one, very similar in my sense of the one of going from what I call the brawn-based economy of manufacturing and manual labor to an automated brain-based economy, which is the one we have today.
Great. I still have many questions. I know we have a couple of questions from the audience that haven't been answered. But given we only have 5 minutes left, I'll just throw out this one last question for everyone. Just very briefly, can you give us example of the ones of one of the most sustainable cities in your mind, and how so? If you have any final word you'd like to share with the audience, just very briefly. We'll start with Professor Zhu, and then Professor Li, Professor Liu, and Professor Cohen in that order.
我要讲的一个总结性的话呢，就是可持续发展是共同的原理，不同的战略。因为我看那个听众里面也有问的，就大家对可持续发展是要落地啊，五花八门的，做起来有各种困难，政府有政府的，个人有个人的，企业有个人。我就讲原理是共同的，但是它的这个操作性呢，应该是因地制宜的。纽约有纽约的问题，上海有上海的问题，北京有北京的问题，可能要抓住不同的重点。经济社会环境它的比重在各个地方的各个阶段是不一样的。如果我就简单的回应郭博士的这个问题好了，谢谢。
你有一个觉得最可持续的城市吗？作为一个例子给大家分享的，有吗？
你想讲是中国还是这个？我本来是想问你们两位的，我又想美国那个最可惜的城市，如果要你们举是谁？纽约算不算？因为我跟南边的大学里面接触比较多，他们说波特兰是比较好的，这个书比较多，但是纽约我觉得在超大城市里边啊，在 global city 里边。纽约的因为纽约的规划我关注比较多了，他在这方面做的他不是自上而下的，这个倒是做的蛮好的。那么在中国呢，现在要说一个全方位的一个标杆啊，我就很难说。那个排行榜啊，我都不太认他的，因为排行榜有的时候它的经济比得比较高以后就决定它，但是这个不同的情况，比如说以生态为主的。或者以社会为主的，这倒是可能可以讲一点的。在国内那些中等城市的，你像是珠海啊，这些城市，我倒觉得是蛮有点超越性的这种发展的味道。
珠海之前在我们的排名上也是连续好像2-3年都是第1位吧？这2年是杭州。对，我觉得你讲的很好，这原理共同，但是操作的话要因地制宜。李老师。
Well, it's a hard question to answer, and if we highlight one of the sustainable city, it's not very easy to understand to say. But I would say that the Beijing is getting better these for the decade years, because I was come to Beijing for 10 years before, and in Beijing a lot of the Chengzhongcun, and a lot of building was constructed in the last 80 or 90 years, last decade. And during these years, the Beijing is trying to make more ecological, such as make some, the public park and the pocket park go through the railway line and the river line. And it's getting better, and also for the ventilation. In 2016, the ventilation air pollution is quite serious during that period. But it's really getting better and better. For a city, I think when I went to Singapore, I think that Singapore is much better. It is a garden city, and the people's, the living style is quite sustainability, because they have a limited resource, and they have to do more about to take more care about their resources. And before this question ago, Professor Cohen talked about the technology, and I would say that in a city, yes, the technology is quite important for the building, especially for the public building and the large public building. They are quite important for technology is quite important for that. But another aspect is as the architecture design aspect, the passive design is quite important. For example, the building envelope insulation, especially in North China, and also the orientation and some spaces. because during my previous research, I was doing some researches on the public, especially for the large public building, and I accumulate a lot of information how the energy pathway energy goes to each state, and for example, some kind of space we designed is better for the main space to save the energy. So as a long aspect of the building, maybe for the maintaining and the usage stage, the building design phase of the passive design and combined with the technology, the high technology, high efficiency technology is quite important for future big city for their sustainable development. That is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Liu, your favorite, I guess the most sustainable city, and any final words for the audience?
很赞成朱老师刚才提到的。其实我们在这个如果要说的话，不同的城市它的问题是很不一样的，那么而且规模也很不一样。在这种情况下，我们可能去谈谁是最好的典范，可能就需要去分出很多的类型，才可以去讲在哪一个范畴里面它是最好的典范，这个很难去单独的这样说。那当然从大的这个角度来说，我刚才提到就是说像我们的这个所划定的这些最基本的这个大的生态保护的这些东西作为一个基础，它是最关键的问题。在这个基础上呢，我想每一个城市可能确实有自己的路径。有一些地方来说，可能经济问题远远的大于经济的它的这个可持续性，远远的大于它的环境方面的要求。那有些地方可能社会问题也要远远大得多，所以这些个差距确实要因地制宜。所以我觉得朱老师讲的这个点特别的重要。
谢谢。Lastly, Professor Cohen, we'd be very interested to learn if you pick a city that you think is most sustainable or not really, and then any final word you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, I wouldn't say that any city's accomplished this yet. I think many are in transition. I know there's a town in Abu Dhabi that was set up specifically to be sustainable and has a renewable resource base to it, and its agriculture is circular. But I think what's most important right now is people's attitudes and values are starting to reflect the importance of these issues. And I think we are in the middle of the change in different cities who are at different stages. I think what you're just hearing about Beijing, is an example. One of the things that we've discovered is people like to breathe. They kind of get used to it, and they want to keep doing it. And if the air, you get off the airplane and the air is gray or orange, and there's no moisture in the air, it's a little scary. And so I think that we saw this in California in the 1960s. If you went to Los Angeles in 1965, from downtown Los Angeles, you couldn't see the mountains, which were literally 5 miles away, because the smog was getting trapped between the ocean and the mountains. That made California very interested in air pollution regulation. Well, then over these years since then, over the last half century, we've seen additional concerns about different issues. And in the case of climate change, we're seeing more rapid extreme weather events. And so climate resiliency and worrying about flooding and hurricanes and heat waves and the whole range of these issues has now become part of people's consciousness. And I think that we are starting to see a deeper understanding, particularly in the developed world, but I think in the developing world as well, because of the miracle of mass communication. So You know, I have no city that I would pick out as an example, but I would say that what I'm very encouraged by is the worldwide growth of understanding of the same issues that form the foundation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that that's a very promising part of the world right now.